They called it the cruelest winter the Texas plains had seen in decades. Winds howled across the open prairie with the wrath of 1,000 hungry wolves, and the snow came in waves that devoured everything in sight. Few dared to travel beyond the safety of Fort Parker's gates, fearing that nature would claim them before hostile hands ever could. Yet on this merciless night, a young widow cradled her newborn twins in a rickety old cabin that was supposed to be her refuge. Instead, it became her prison. No one rode to help her. Only death seemed to roam the plains, until a lone Comanche hunter appeared from the whirling dark. Martha Caldwell's world had been turned upside down in less time than it took a bullet to leave a gun's barrel. Only a year earlier, she had arrived on the outskirts of the Brazos River, with her husband, James Caldwell, determined to carve out a life on the promise of fertile farmland and wide-open skies. They had heard the tales of the harshness of the land of raids by Comanche warriors, and of the punishing winters that could freeze a man solid overnight if he wasn't prepared. But for the young couple, hope had always beaten out fear. Their first year on the homestead brought small victories: a modest cabin, a lean-to stable, and a patch of tilled earth that gave just enough crop to get by. Martha clung to simple joys: morning sunlight that danced across the fields, an occasional rabbit to stew for supper, and the quiet presence of James. When they found out she was with child, James's eyes glistened with the excitement of building a family in this place they could call their own. Yet fate proved cruel. Illness swept through the sparse settlement, that fall striking both cattle and humans alike. Many whispered that travelers passing through from Fort Parker had carried a sickness, but no one knew for certain. James caught a fever, and in the span of a week, Martha watched him wither away. His last breaths were spent, apologizing, begging her forgiveness for leaving her alone in such a wild land. Martha buried him in a small plot near an oak tree that overlooked the Brazos River. She made a crude wooden cross and wept until her tears ran dry. Then she was forced to gather her strength, for she was still expecting and had little choice but to carry on. Survival was a cruel teacher, and it gave no allowances for grief. The settlement they lived nearest to a small cluster of huts and cabins, known by its residents simply as Willow's Fork, was more than 3 miles away. Few neighbors bothered to check in on the grieving widow, assuming she had family, or that she might soon pack up and return to the civilized East. Martha, determined not to abandon the land James had worked so hard to tame, stayed put and waited for the births that stirred in her belly. As autumn's golden leaves fell, the wind turned biting. Early snows dusted the plains, and nights lengthened into a polar gloom. Martha did the best she could to insulate the cabin. She sealed cracks in the walls with clay and old rags, stacked firewood high against the walls, and prayed for mercy each time a grey cloud rolled overhead. When the time came, Martha gave birth alone, the howling wind outside competing with her own cries of labor. 2 babies, a boy and a girl, Isaac and Isabel, were born into a world of fragile hope and roaring storms. She felt an indescribable fierceness rise within her as she held them against her chest. She vowed she would do anything to protect these little miracles. But nature, it seemed, had no sympathy for such vows. Weeks crawled on, and the weather only worsened. Roads to Willow's Fork became choked with snowdrifts. Travel to Fort Parker was nearly impossible, and the biting wind stripped any warmth from the land. Martha rationed every bit of food, cooking thin broths from whatever dried beans and bits of salted meat she had left. Hunger gnawed at her, but the twins always ate first. Ruth Johnson, one of the few settlers who had befriended Martha, managed to visit once, before the blizzards made travel impossible. She arrived with a small bag of flour and a handful of desperate warnings. They say folks are leaving heading south before the river crosses freeze. Some are even giving up on their claims. This winter will bury us all if we ain't careful. Martha thanked her for the supplies and the news, but she wouldn't leave. Not without a fight. This land was all she had left of James, and though she was terrified, her stubbornness would not let her run. Still, loneliness nibbled at her sanity, like starving mice at a loaf of bread. One evening when the babies were asleep, she rocked in her wooden chair and stared at the flickering fire. Outside, the wind rattled the window shutters with a fury that made the entire cabin tremble. She tried not to imagine dark shapes in the swirling snow. Yet a sense of foreboding weighed on her heart. Something was coming, something more than a storm. They arrived in the dead of night. First, Martha thought it was the wind thrashing the door, but then she heard the unmistakable thud of fists pounding against the wood. Isabel and Isaac woke and started crying, their wails piercing the gloom. She rushed to hush them, fear pricking her spine. Who would visit at such an hour? Through the window, she glimpsed lantern light bobbing in the dark. 4 figures stood outside their silhouettes, large and menacing in the swirling snow. Clutching a small hatchet as her only weapon, Martha unbarred the door. A crack. Who's there? It's Zebulon Rusk. Open up, Martha. We got to talk. She recognized the voice of a neighbor, though they had never been close. Rusk was known more for his ambition than his kindness, a man rumored to have connections with questionable folks. Still, she unlatched the door, letting a blast of frigid air swirl in, biting her cheeks and ears. Rusk and 3 other men shoved their way inside. Snow clung to their coats, and their eyes shone with a ruthless urgency. One was Mark Landry, a surly fellow who'd boasted of leading a vigilante group against any red devils he found on the land. Another was Maxwell Turner, older with a whiskey-soaked beard and an ever-present scowl. The last man was as tall and lanky as a scarecrow, vaguely familiar from Willow's Fork. "What's the meaning of this?" Martha demanded, voice trembling. She hugged the twins, trying to keep them warm and quiet. Rusk rubbed his gloved hands together, stepping close enough that she caught a whiff of stale tobacco. "We got word from the south that Comanche warriors were spotted. We plan on riding out at first light, but we can't have you here alone. You're vulnerable, and you'll slow us down if we have to rescue you. We need you to move." "Move," Martha repeated. She clutched the twins tighter. "We're in this storm." Landry spat on the floor. "Should have left this place when your man died, Martha. No sense waiting around for hostiles or the weather to do you in. We're heading out, you should too." Panic coiled in her chest. "But I have nowhere to go. The trails are blocked by snow and traveling with 2 newborns. In this blizzard is suicide." A flicker of something like guilt or maybe just impatience crossed Rusk's face. "Look, we can't babysit you. We barely have enough provisions for ourselves and our families. The days ahead are going to be rough. We can't risk it." Martha's anger flared. This was James's land. He worked it with his own hands, and I won't abandon it. "Just because you think James is dead," Landry snapped voice, ice cold. "You're on borrowed time, woman. Better wise up, ain't nothing out here but wolves. And worse, we're pulling out of Willow's Fork, heading southward to find safer ground. That means no one's going to be within miles to help you if trouble comes." The men shared tense looks. Finally, Rusk nodded to the others and they filed out. Before he left, he set down a small sack on her table. "Dried meat and a little cornmeal. That's the best I can do. Godspeed." Martha. The door slammed shut behind them. She lunged forward, yelling after them into the storm. "You can't just leave us here. Please." But the wind devoured her screams. Lantern light faded into the darkness until it was gone completely. Snow blew in through the open doorway, piling up across the threshold. Martha's chest heaved as she sank to her knees. The babies bawled again as if sensing her terror. She had to gather herself for their sake. Whatever the men's reasons, cowardice, greed, or fear, they had abandoned her. She was alone, truly alone, in the heart of a raging winter, with two helpless infants relying on her for survival. The next morning, she forced herself outside to check the stable Rusk had taken her horse. The only creature left was her old mule. Toby half lame from a fall on icy ground 2 weeks prior. With Toby in no shape for a long journey, she realized that any hope of fleeing south on her own was slim to none. Instead, she set about fortifying her home. Snow battered the roof and the wind cut through the smallest cracks. She hauled in extra wood, barricaded the door with heavy furniture, and tried to keep a cheerful face for the babies. Though every gust of wind felt like an omen of doom, days passed, each colder than the last. Martha's meager supplies dwindled. She rationed carefully, knowing she needed to keep her strength up for the twins. But the gnaw of hunger was constant. At night, she told herself stories of better times, ignoring the cold that seeped into her bones through blankets and patchy walls. On the 5th night, without any human contact, the storm swelled to a full-blown blizzard. The air roared around the cabin, and the walls groaned under the onslaught. Ice crystals formed on the inside of the window panes. Martha held her crying babies close, feeding them the last bit of warm water mixed with cornmeal. She could manage. Tears froze on her cheeks. But she pressed her lips to Isabel's forehead, then Isaac's, whispering desperately that she loved them. It was near midnight, by her best guess, when the first chunk of the roof caved in. A harrowing crack resounded above, followed by the thunderous crash of timbers and a shower of snow. Martha screamed, shielding the twins under her body. Frost and shattered bits of wood pelted her. The wind now invaded the cabin with vicious glee, swirling snow around the cramped space. She scrambled to get the babies and herself away from the collapse, retreating to a corner. A savage gust tore the feeble lantern from its hook, plunging them into darkness. The temperature plummeted further, and Martha's teeth rattled uncontrollably. Her fingers had gone numb, but she clutched the twins with the strength of a woman fighting for her life. She tried to stay awake, to hush the babies, to keep them warm with her own failing body heat. But exhaustion pressed down on her like a great weight. In the swirling gloom, she thought she saw a figure at the threshold, a tall shape, obscured by the driving snow. She told herself it was her imagination, just her mind conjuring a last feeble hope as she slipped toward unconsciousness. Then the shape moved, stepping into the cabin. A cold wind snuffed out any thought in her mind. She faintly registered a pair of dark eyes, fierce and full of concern, leaning down. Was this death come to claim her children and herself? The wind roared in her ears, and she felt strong arms gathering her against a broad chest. She blacked out before she could comprehend that someone real had come. When Martha next stirred, warmth clung to her in a stifling embrace. She opened her eyes to dancing firelight. The glow hurt her vision, too bright after unrelenting darkness. For a disoriented moment, she thought she might be in her own home, back in the east, safe, with her father stoking the fireplace. But the biting chill across her fingertips reminded her of reality. She was in a small shelter. A cave, perhaps. The walls were rough stone, the ceiling jagged. A fire crackled near the entrance, and the open mouth of the cave revealed swirling snow outside. She tried to sit up, panic flooding her. The babies. Isaac Isabel, a figure crouched by the fire, turning swiftly at her cry. Torchlight danced over his face, revealing a Comanche man, tall, lean, with braids that framed a weathered, proud visage. He wore a combination of deerskin and heavier hides, clearly prepared for winter. Though his gaze was intense, it was not unkind. In his arms he held a small bundle, which he carefully transferred to Martha's lap. Her heart pounded as she recognized Isaac's fair hair peeking out from the blankets. The Comanche man made a calming gesture, then indicated a second bundle lying nearby, also alive and well. Isabel's relief poured through Martha, leaving her almost dizzy. She didn't care that her rescuer was Comanche. He had saved her children. She pressed Isaac close to her chest. His tiny face was pinched red from cold, but he was breathing. She looked over to Isabel and saw the same signs of life. Tears welled in her eyes. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse croak emerged. The man turned and rummaged through a leather pouch, retrieving a small pouch of water. He offered it to her, holding it so she could sip. The water tasted of smoke and something bitter, but she welcomed it. When she could speak again, she managed a quiet, "Thank you." Her voice trembled, and she wasn't sure if he understood. There was no guarantee that he spoke any English, nor that her words would mean anything to him. But he gave a slight nod as if acknowledging her gratitude. She looked around the cave, noticing belongings that indicated this was not just a temporary hideout. A few hides were stacked neatly, and there were tools for scraping and cleaning game. A small pile of carved arrow shafts, and a quiver. She realized that this man had probably been out hunting, perhaps for deer or buffalo, when the storm forced him to seek refuge here. By some miracle he had come across her ruined cabin instead. "Who are you?" she ventured. The man regarded her for a moment, then tapped his chest. "Tsoai," he said. "Tsoai," she repeated softly, feeling the name out. She placed her hand against her chest, Martha. A short silence. Then Tsoai inclined his head in understanding. He nodded at the babies, a quiet question in his eyes. Martha said their names, slowly indicating each twin in turn. Tsoai attempted to repeat them with some difficulty, prompting a faint smile to tug at Martha's lips. Despite her perilous situation, she tried not to let her mind race with fear. The Comanches had a fierce reputation in the region. Raiders who struck without warning, took captives, and meted out harsh punishments to settlers. Yet here sat Tsoai, offering her water, sharing his fire, and saving her and her children from certain death. Whatever reason he had for this, she could not label him an enemy. Over the next few hours, Tsoai fed the fire with small branches and bits of dried grass from his pack. Martha held each twin close in turn, doing her best to warm them. Rubbing their hands and feet gently, Tsoai motioned to a thick buffalo hide near the back of the cave, indicating that she could use it for extra cover. Gratefully, Martha settled herself and the babies beneath it, the hide blocking out much of the cold that seeped through the cave walls. The wind still howled outside. Each time a gust rattled through, Tsoai moved closer to the entrance, peering out into the swirling snow as if wary of something. The second or third time he did this, Martha realized that he might be expecting other Comanche, or even a patrol of armed settlers. Fear twisted her stomach and knew if either side found them together, it could spell catastrophe. Still, Tsoai betrayed no outward concern, only vigilance. Martha's thoughts churned. The men who abandoned her spoke often of Comanche raids, but this man before her seemed entirely focused on helping, not harming. She thought back to James, how he'd always believed in the possibility of peace. "They're people same as us," he once said. "We can learn from them, trade with them, so long as we respect their ways." He'd never had the chance to put that into practice before his death. She wondered if Tsoi had lost anyone to settler violence. If so, was he haunted by ghosts as she was? Was she now living proof to him that not all settlers were cruel or greedy, or was she simply another human in need? And that was enough for him to act. Early the next morning, the wind tapered down to a low moan. The snowfall lessened, and the light coming in through the mouth of the cave was muted grey instead of impenetrable darkness. So I emerged from a doze and rose to his feet, stretching. He moved to the cave entrance, and with careful steps he ventured outside. Martha clutched the twins, anxiety fluttering in her chest. She dared not follow him, though she wanted to see how badly the storm had ravaged the land. She feared that stepping outside would compromise the warmth that Tsoi had so painstakingly built up. She peeked at Isaac, who cooed softly, a sign of returning strength, and her heart soared. Isabel stirred as well, tiny fists opening and closing against her blanket. They were alive against all odds. She had Tsoi to thank for that. Minutes later, Tsoi returned, his boots caked with fresh snow. He said something in Comanche that Martha couldn't decipher, but he beckoned for her to stand. Then he mimed walking, pointing outside, and gently tapped his own chest. She understood he intended to travel. Perhaps he felt it was safer to move before conditions worsened again. Or perhaps he wanted to return her to her people at Willow's Fork or Fort Parker. She was unsure, but she knew one thing: she had no choice but to trust him. If she stayed here alone, her children would surely die. So she nodded. Tsoi's expression softened with what might have been relief. He handed her a water skin, gesturing for her to drink. Then he gathered his gear, while Martha, balancing both twins, attempted to stand on unsteady legs. Pain flared in her joints from days of near starvation and cold, but she pushed through. She refused to be a burden, not when someone had saved them from certain death. Before leaving, Tsoi banked the fire, scattering embers across the cave floor. He glanced at Martha once more to ensure she was ready. With the twins wrapped securely against her chest and her meager coat pulled tight, she followed him into the frigid morning air. In the wild warmth doesn't come from fire, it comes from trust. The snow didn't stop falling. It thickened, blanketing the prairie in a quiet, suffocating white. For Martha, time blurred into a slow, endless rhythm of snowflakes, numb toes and the fragile cries of her twins wrapped tightly to her chest. Tsoi walked ahead, cutting a path through the drifts, one snowshoe after another. His movement was silent but purposeful. Like a shadow with breath, Martha followed closely, her legs aching, her fingers stiff. And yet something within her pressed forward, the rhythm of her baby's breathing, the hope in their survival. The landscape offered nothing but frozen wind and the ache of the horizon. Trees were rare, and when they found them, Tsoi would pause to break a few dry limbs, starting a small fire beneath overhanging rocks. He never spoke unless necessary, but his gestures were clear here. Rest here. Drink here. Feed the children. On the third night, Martha watched him from across the fire. Her hands cradled her sons as they nursed quietly, their cheeks red with cold, but no longer dangerously pale. She was no longer afraid of Tsoi. Instead, she was afraid of how much she had come to depend on him. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked up from sharpening his knife. "A nod, mother strong," he replied in halting. "English." Boys strong. Not many survive this. She looked down at her sons, then back at him. They wouldn't have survived without you, so I didn't answer, but his eyes softened. In the firelight, Martha noticed something she hadn't seen before. Scars across his hands. Faded burns along one forearm. A man shaped by survival, just like her. Each day after that brought some small change, so I showed her how to wrap her feet tighter with cloth to keep warmth in. He gave her a rabbit to skin and guided her with gestures on how to cook it over the fire. She in turn tried to teach him words rock, she said, once holding it up. He repeated the sound, smiling faintly, stone he corrected in Comanche, placing his hand over his heart. Stone strong. There was no laughter. Not in the traditional sense, but the edges of their silence softened. One evening they found shelter beneath a wind-sculpted ledge. The wind howled outside, but inside it was still, so I began placing branches for a fire, and Martha sat down, placing the boys between her knees. As she rocked them gently, her voice broke the silence. "My husband," she said, "he died last winter. Fever. The ranch hands buried him on the edge of the homestead." Her voice caught. I thought we'd be safe, but they left me. The snow came, and they left me behind, so I stared into the fire for a long time. "They left you to die," he said at last. His voice was low, like they leave buffalo bones. Martha looked up. "You know what that feels like?" He nodded. "Yes." White soldiers came to our camp, promised peace, burned everything. The fire cracked between them. It didn't feel like talking. It felt like bleeding quietly side by side. By the end of the 6th day, they began to recognize landmarks, broken trees she remembered from the edge of the frontier. So I gestured toward the sun's path and pointed northeast. "2 more sleeps," he said. "Then your people." Martha felt something strange at the thought of arrival. Relief, of course, but also fear. What if no one waited for her? What if they judged her for walking beside a Comanche, accepting food from his hands, shelter under his protection? That night, as the twins slept, swaddled between them, Martha turned to Zoe. "What will you do when we get there?" she asked. He considered the question. "Leave just like that?" "Yes." "Why did you help me?" He paused. "You had children. You did not scream when you saw me. You tried to protect them. That is strength, I saw it. And..." He looked away as if the words cost him something, because once my sister was left alone, in snow, no one came. Martha reached over and took his hand gently. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't break the moment. Instead, they sat in silence, not as settler and Comanche, but as 2 survivors the world had tried to discard. The final morning they crossed a narrow stream. The sky had cleared, and distant smoke rose from the cabins beyond the ridge. Home, or what remained of it, waited. Martha turned to Zoe. "They may not accept you," she said. "I know I want them to." He offered a faint smile. "I do not need them. I only needed to see you safe." She nodded, blinking back tears. "I don't have much," she whispered. "But what I do have, I owe to you." So I stepped back, placing a hand to his chest. Then he turned, disappearing into the trees without another word. Martha stood there, holding her sons, watching the man who had walked her through the storm vanish into the forest. He had asked for nothing, taken nothing, and yet he had given her everything. And as she stepped over the ridge toward the cabins, toward whatever future awaited her and her sons, she knew that somewhere in the wild, where snow still fell and fire still fought the wind, Tsoi walked alone, but not forgotten. At sunrise, Martha rose with a sense of purpose. The good folk of Kirkland's Pass, though kind, were suspicious of anything that reminded them of Comanche raids. She had to be cautious after washing up and feeding the twins with a bit of goat's milk provided by one of the families she slipped outside. The air remained cold, but the storm had lifted for now. She told one of the men standing guard that she needed to gather some kindling from the nearby woods. He nodded, unconcerned. With trembling resolution, she ventured into the trees. Each step made her heart pound. Fear that she'd find no sign of Tsoi, or worse, find him attacked or taken prisoner. As soon as she was beyond the settlement's line of sight, she began calling his name, softly, Tsoi, Tsoi. A moment passed, then a slight rustle in the snow-laden brush caught her ear. She turned to see him emerge, eyes cautious. Relief flooded her so strongly she could have cried. She stepped forward, forgetting for an instant all the reasons they should be wary. She grabbed his arm, looking up at him with desperate gratitude. "I'm safe," she said, voice trembling. "They took me in, gave me food for the twins." Tsoi watched her carefully, his gaze flicking toward the settlement. He made a gesture as though to ask if it was safe for him to approach Martha. Hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "They fear Comanches. They might hurt you." She felt a twist in her gut, the unfairness choking her. This man had risked everything to save them. Yet these settlers might greet him with a bullet. Tsoi's jaw tightened. He spoke a few words in Comanche that she couldn't understand. There was regret in his tone. He motioned to the forest, then to the horizon. She realized he meant to leave to continue his life, no longer burdened by the mother and children he'd rescued. Panic coiled in her chest. She clutched at his hand. No, please, she couldn't articulate her need to repay him or her fear of never seeing him again. She wanted to promise that not all settlers were cruel, that maybe they could find a way to coexist. But her tongue felt thick with unsaid truths. Tsoi gently freed himself from her grip. He offered a small, knowing smile, the lines of his face etched with a kindness that defied the narratives of savagery she'd grown up hearing. Then he pulled something from a pouch at his side, a small talisman carved from bone, shaped like a hawk with tiny markings along its surface. He pressed it into her palm, folding her fingers around it, a gift of protection. Perhaps a token of gratitude. She wasn't entirely sure, but the significance was clear. A piece of himself, a blessing or a remembrance. Tears burned in her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you." She wanted to say so much more, that he was the reason her children lived, that he had shown her kindness when her own people turned away. But he simply nodded, then stepped back. With a final lingering glance, he turned and disappeared into the snowy woodland. Martha stood there, the carved hawk clutched in her hand, until the cold forced her back to reality. She gathered a few sticks to maintain her cover story and returned to the settlement, burdened by a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Over the next few days, she realized that while these settlers were kinder than the men who abandoned her, their generosity had limits. Supplies were running dangerously low. Rumors of an imminent Comanche raid circulated every night, fueled by the fact that the wagon train from Fort Parker had not arrived. Some whispered that Tsoi's people had already attacked the wagon train, killing or capturing everyone. Martha's heart clenched at such talk, but she lacked the courage to defend the Comanche openly. She could only clutch her babies closer and remain silent. Then came the day she feared. A rider arrived at Kirkland's Pass, half frozen and desperate. It was none other than Zebulon Rusk, the same man who had left her to die. He told a wild story of how the small group he traveled with was set upon by a Comanche war party. Most of his companions were dead. He claimed slaughtered. He fled wounded with a bullet scrape along his arm, odd for a Comanche raid, but no one questioned him in the face of such a horrific tale. Rusk's eyes nearly popped out of his head when he saw Martha alive, tending a small fire for the babies. His shock was obvious, but he quickly masked it with a grin that couldn't hide the guilt in his eyes. Martha Hedgener, how in tarnation did you? She regarded him coldly, the memory of him standing in her cabin with those other men, telling her to fend for herself, burned into her mind. But for the sake of the settlement, she forced herself to remain civil. "I survived," was all she said, but her tone dripped with unspoken accusation. Rusk's gaze flicked to the twins, then to Martha's worn coat and the bone talisman she wore around her neck. Suspicion darkened his features. She tensed, afraid he might guess the truth that a Comanche saved her. He seemed to weigh his next words carefully, but the gawking onlookers distracted him. Preacher Harold hustled the wounded man inside to tend his arm, and soon Rusk was regaling everyone with tales of how vicious the Comanches were, how they butchered men, women and children without mercy. That night the settlement was on high alert. Everyone who could hold a gun was handed one, and Rusk was quick to place himself as a leader. He roused the men, filling them with fear of an impending raid. "If they're out there," he said, "we best strike first. Don't give 'em the chance to slip in and slaughter us in our sleep." Martha's stomach churned. She prayed that Zoe had left the area for good, but she couldn't be certain. If Rusk led a war party into the woods, might they cross paths with him? The thought made her blood run cold. She considered warning Zoe somehow, but with Rusk's eyes on her, any attempt to leave the settlement would raise suspicion. All the while, the supplies continued to dwindle, and arguments broke out over rationing. A biting wind returned, threatening another storm. The entire settlement balanced on a knife's edge. Martha found herself once again, alone, tied to a community that was more concerned with survival than justice. At dawn, a scouting party of 5 men rode out, Rusk leading them. They planned to sweep the surrounding woods for any sign of Comanche presence. Martha watched them depart with dread. Preacher Harold noticed her trembling hands and tried to offer consolation. She wanted to scream, to yell that Rusk was a liar, that not all Comanches were marauders. But the memory of being left to die kept her silent. A hardened knot of resentment burning inside, evening descended in a swirl of grey snow. The scouting party had not returned. Anxiety spread through Kirkland's Pass like wildfire. Some believed the men had been ambushed. Others thought they simply got lost in the storm. Martha tried to keep the twins, soothed her own nerves, frayed. She was in the main cabin, feeding Isabel a meager spoonful of watered-down milk, when a shout echoed from outside. Men scrambled to the door, rifles at the ready. Through the icy window, Martha caught sight of a figure stumbling into the settlement, dragging another behind him. It was Rusk, face white with shock, and beside him was one of his men, Landry, bleeding from an arrow wound in the leg. Comanches. Rusk roared, "They ambushed us! Killed Turnbull and Mattis. We had to run." He half collapsed as settlers rushed forward, dragging the wounded man into the cabin. Chaos erupted. People demanded to know how many Comanche there were if they were following, if an attack was imminent. Rusk's eyes darted around, wildly, sweat beading on his brow, despite the cold. I counted maybe 15. He gasped, though his earlier story mentioned a smaller group. They're coming this way. We gotta fortify. Martha's heart pounded. 15. That seemed unlikely for a scouting or hunting party, especially in dead winter. Rusk's stories changed every time he told them, but the settlement, already trembling with fear, latched onto his words. Within minutes, Preacher Harold and a few others were stacking crates and furniture against doorways, preparing to fight a siege. Landry groaned, clutching his wounded leg. Martha knelt to see if she could help, if only to glean the truth. He was delirious, muttering about seeing shadows in the trees, hearing war cries. She suspected some of that was real. Comanches might have been hunting in the area, but nothing about Soai suggested his people would gather an entire war party to descend on a small settlement with no valuable resources. Unless... Her thoughts froze. Unless Rusk and Landry had shot first or done something to provoke them, she wouldn't put it past him. Fear gave way to anger. She felt the bone talisman against her chest, a solid reminder of Soai's kindness. Could he be among the Comanches? Rusk encountered. The notion twisted her stomach. Night fell still. No sign of an attack. Rusk paced, paranoid, inciting the settlement's men to keep watch. Martha overheard him whispering to Preacher Harold that they needed to send a rider for help. Someone to reach Fort Parker or any other militia. Harold argued that it was too dangerous. A lone rider would be picked off easily. Tension soared until every snap of a twig outside made people jump. Finally, exhaustion overcame them. Landry's wound was dressed by the settlement's one makeshift medic, and the men took turns on watch. Rusk slumped in a corner, biting his nails. Martha sat by the hearth eyes on the door. Babies wrapped in warm blankets. She could sense that something big loomed. Her instincts proved correct. Near midnight, the watchman's shouts pierced the stillness. Riders incoming, 6 or 7, heading this way. Instantly, the settlement sprang into defensive chaos. Men grabbed rifles, women herded children behind overturned tables, and Rusk bellowed for everyone to hold their positions. Martha crouched, shielding Isabel and Isaac, her heart in her throat. Could it be Soai? Had he returned with some of his tribe? Voices rose outside, but not in Comanche. The accent was Texan guttural cursing about the cold. A second voice barked, "Hold your fire!" "We're from Fort Parker, looking for survivors." Relief swept through the cabin. Rusk rushed out, likely planning to spin his version of events. Martha peered through a crack in the door. Lantern light revealed a group of uniformed men, likely volunteers or militia from Fort Parker, led by a stocky bearded man who wore a battered cavalry hat. The men dismounted, glancing around warily, rifles half-cocked. What happened here demanded their leader, hooking a thumb at Rusk. Rusk launched into his story, painting himself as a hero who'd tried to rescue Martha only to be ambushed multiple times by vicious Comanches. He claimed the entire region was teeming with hostiles. Martha's nails dug into her palms. She wanted to protest, but fear silenced her. The militia leader, who introduced himself as Captain Breckenridge, eyed Rusk with skepticism. "We've been to Willow's Fork. Found it abandoned, but saw no sign of a large Comanche presence." "Are you sure about these numbers?" Rusk nodded vigorously. Voice rising. "I swear on my life, I lost a dozen good men already. They got savage warriors out there." A flicker of doubt passed across Captain Breckenridge's face. He glanced at the battered settlement, the frantic occupants. "We'll post guards for the night, see if any hostiles approach. In the morning, we'll decide our next move." The settlement exhaled, grateful for the presence of armed men, albeit uncertain how long they'd stay. The militia wasted no time in setting a perimeter, ordering the locals to keep calm. Captain Breckenridge asked if there were any casualties or pressing concerns. Martha quietly spoke up. "We have a wounded man shot by an arrow. Might need better medical attention." Breckenridge nodded. "I'll have my medic see to him." As the men bustled about, Martha's gaze drifted to Rusk, who hovered near the captain, likely continuing to spin tall tales. A fiery resolve ignited inside her. She couldn't let him go unchallenged forever. He had left her and her babies to die. He was stirring up fear, possibly endangering Tsoi and his people. Something had to be done. Morning dawned grey and bleak, but without fresh snow. Captain Breckenridge mustered his men preparing to ride a patrol around the settlement. He instructed Rusk to guide them to the site of the alleged ambush. Rusk swallowed hard, but he had little choice. He had bragged too much to back out now. Martha, seizing her chance, approached the captain. "Sir, if I may speak with you privately." Breckenridge studied her warily, but sensed the urgency in her voice. He led her aside. "Yes, ma'am." She took a breath, heart pounding. "Rusk hasn't told you everything. Months ago, he and some others left me to die in my cabin with my newborn twins. He took my horse, my supplies, and abandoned me. I would have perished if not for someone else." She stopped short of naming Tsoi. The captain's frown deepened. "That's a heavy accusation, ma'am. Are you certain?" Martha nodded, voice trembling with pent-up anger. "He lies about Comanche war parties. He might have started fights himself. He's a coward who turned on his own people. Now he's desperate to cover his tracks." Captain Breckenridge eyed her with a measuring gaze. "Why would he do such a thing? Greed," she spat. "He wanted my land, or at least to push me out. And now he's spun a story of endless Comanche raids to justify why so many of his men died, but it doesn't add up." The captain considered this, glancing at Rusk in the distance. "We'll see what we find out on the patrol. In the meantime, keep that to yourself. If he senses you've spoken ill of him, he might do something rash." Martha nodded, relieved that at least someone heard her side. She retreated to the main cabin, heart hammering. She prayed that truth would surface. She also worried that Tsoi might be caught in the crossfire. If Rusk led the militia to some Comanche hunting party, it could end in tragedy. Shortly after Rusk and the militia rode out. Hours ticked by the settlement, restless afternoon. Shadows stretched. Then a gunshot echoed in the distance, followed by faint shouting. Martha paced, biting her lip until it bled. Eventually, as dusk settled, they returned. A few men had minor injuries, but no sign of a pitched battle. Captain Breckenridge dismounted near the corral. Rusk sliding down beside him. The expressions on their faces spoke volumes: conflict, disbelief, and anger. Rusk's lip was split, likely from a scuffle. When Preacher Harold rushed forward to demand an explanation, Breckenridge raised a hand. "False alarm," he muttered. "We found no large Comanche camp. Only a small group, 2 men, a woman and a boy, likely hunting for game." Rusk panicked, fired first. They shot back in self-defense. We managed to defuse it before more blood was spilled. His tone was laden with disgust. Then he fixed Rusk with a glare that could strip paint. "This man here has misled us. There's no sign of a war party, just families trying to survive. I nearly lost 2 of my men to his lies." Preacher Harold looked at Rusk. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Rusk stammered. "They attacked us before, killed my men. I was protecting y'all, I swear it." But his words rang hollow. Breckenridge turned on him. "We questioned Landry while you were separated. He admitted you shot first in the previous engagement, too." Said it was your idea to scare folks into leaving so you could claim more land. Seems you were hoping to push out any neighbors using Comanche raids as an excuse." A hush fell. Martha's breath caught in her throat. So it was true. Her nails bit into her palms. As rage rose, mingled with vindication, Rusk's betrayal was finally laid bare. Facing the entire settlement, Rusk's bravado crumbled. "I did what I had to do," he insisted, voice breaking. "I was just y'all don't understand. The frontier is tough. We gotta do what it takes to survive. Preacher." Harold's eyes blazed. "That doesn't justify leaving a mother and her newborns to freeze." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "You nearly caused a war with the Comanche. Are you mad?" Rusk's face, twisted fear replaced by defiance. "I ain't rotting in these snows playing nice with murderers." That was the final straw for Captain Breckenridge. He signaled 2 of his men who seized Rusk's arms. The weasel of a man struggled, but he was exhausted, his bravado spent. Preacher Harold looked at Martha, sadness in his gaze. "I'm sorry for what happened. I had no idea." Martha said nothing, trembling from the memory of that horrible night, from the cold that nearly claimed her children. Her silence was more damning than any words she could speak. Breckenridge spoke gravely. "We'll take him back to Fort Parker. Let the magistrate decide his punishment." Rusk paled. "I did nothing but protect our land. Y'all are turning your backs on your own kind for the sake of a swift punch from one of Breckenridge's men. Shut him up." They bound his hands with rope. The settlement watched a collective sense of relief and lingering shock. Martha felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Still her thoughts drifted to Tsoi. Rusk would face justice, but the damage had been done. Blood spilled. Tensions stoked. Part of her wanted to ask Captain Breckenridge if he'd seen a lone hunter, if Tsoi was safe. But fear clutched at her throat. If Tsoi was recognized as the one who rescued her, unscrupulous men might still target him. She resolved to keep that precious truth to herself, to honor the risk he'd taken for her children. One day, she hoped she might find a way to repay him properly. For now, justice meant ensuring Rusk no longer posed a threat. She held her babies close, letting them feel the quiet strength she had discovered in the face of betrayal. The next day, the militia prepared to escort Rusk back to Fort Parker. Landry, his leg healing, refused to ride with Rusk. He had turned witness to save his own skin. As they bound Rusk to a horse, a hush fell across the settlement. Some of the townsfolk spat at him, others simply turned away. Disgusted, Martha stood on the edge of the crowd, heart heavy. He caught her eye, a flicker of hatred and regret flashing across his face. She stared back, unflinching. They both knew the truth. His fate was sealed by his own cruelty. She hoped the court at Fort Parker would punish him severely. Let the law show him the same mercy he showed her and her children, which was none at all. When the small column of riders disappeared into the whitened horizon, the settlement exhaled, as if freed from a spell. Preacher Harold turned to Martha. "You and the little ones can stay as long as you need. Martha, the Lord knows it's still winter, but we'll do our best by you." She managed a grateful nod. "Thank you." Her voice was quiet, but a sense of peace seeped into her bones. At least for now. She was safe, and her children had a chance. That was more than she had dared hope when she first stared into that lethal winter storm. Yet that night, she found herself standing outside, gazing at the moonlit plain. She felt the bone talisman pressed against her chest. In her mind, she saw Tsoi's solemn face, his gentle hands cradling Isaac, guiding her through the snow, when no one else cared whether she lived or died. She whispered a soft prayer that he might find safe return to his people, free from the hatred and brutality that men like Rusk perpetuated. She would not forget. She would teach her children to remember the Comanche man who saved their lives, proving the boundaries between settler and native need not always be etched in blood. And if destiny allowed one day, she might cross paths with him again under kinder skies, as winter's icy grip slowly loosened. Martha Caldwell and her twins stood as living proof that compassion could defy cruelty on the untamed frontier. Though betrayal had nearly claimed their lives, a Comanche hunter's bravery and the eventual reckoning of Zebulon Rusk proved that fate could weave unexpected alliances. Martha stayed on at Kirkland's Pass for a time, forging a fragile peace in her heart. Each night she touched the carved bone talisman and whispered gratitude for Soai's kindness. And with each new dawn, she told Isaac and Isabel the story of how one man's mercy conquered a winter more merciless than any storm. Thank you so much for listening to this tale of survival, betrayal, and redemption. If you found inspiration and hope in Martha's story, please like this video, share it with friends who love a good Wild West drama, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that illuminate the human spirit even in the darkest of times. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful tales from the frontier and beyond. Stay warm, stay true, and we'll see you in the next story.